talk about off-market homes in Alamo Heights and how it actually works. If you've been searching for a home in Alamo Heights, Terrell Hills, or Olmos Park, you've probably heard the terms off-market homes, off-market listings, private listings, or even pocket listings. And for a lot of buyers, those terms immediately create a sense that there's a hidden layer of real estate market that they're not seeing, almost like there are homes available that never make it online, never show up in search results, and are only accessible to a small group of people who somehow know where to look. And that idea is compelling because it feels like access. It feels like an advantage. It feels like maybe there's an opportunity to find something before anyone else does. But what's important to understand is while off-market homes are real, the way they actually work is very different than how most people know. If you approach this part of the market with the wrong expectations, it can feel frustrating, confusing, or even inaccessible. But when you understand how it actually functions, it becomes much more clear, much more strategic, and much more realistic to navigate, especially in higher-end areas like Alamo Heights, where a portion of sellers choose not to publicly list their homes right away. So what I want to do is walk through the 7 things you need to understand about off-market homes so that you can approach this with clarity instead of assumptions. And the first thing you need to understand is that off-market does not mean invisible. It means limited exposure. And that distinction is critical because a lot of buyers imagine off-market homes as completely hidden properties that no one knows about. But in reality, most off-market listings are simply being shared in a more controlled way. They might be discussed within a brokerage. They might be shared between agents. They might be mentioned in conversations with qualified buyers. And in some cases, they exist as what we call pocket listings, where the home is available, but intentionally not marketed broadly. And the reason for this is usually tied to the seller's preferences, not because the home is meant to be secret. And to make this more real, imagine a homeowner in Alamo Heights who's considering selling, but doesn't want the disruption of showings, doesn't want their home photographed and distributed online, and isn't in a position where they need to sell quickly. That seller may be open to selling, but only if the right buyer comes along. And instead of listing publicly, they allow a small number of conversations to happen behind the scenes. And that's what creates an off-market opportunity. It's not invisible, it's selectively visible. And that leads directly into the second thing you need to understand, which is off-market homes are driven by seller motivation, not buyer demand. And this is where the process works very differently from what most buyers are used to. Because in the traditional market, homes are listed, buyers respond to them. But in the off-market space, the opportunity exists because a seller is open to the conversation, not because they're actively trying to attract as many buyers as possible. And that changes everything about how the process works, because the seller is not competing for attention. They are evaluating whether it makes sense to sell at all. And that means the dynamic is much more about alignment than urgency. For example, a homeowner in Terrell Hills may have owned their home for many years. They have no pressure to move and only consider selling if the timing, price, and terms feel right. And that means the opportunity is very specific, not broadly available. It's situational. That's why many buyers who are looking for off-market homes feel like they're missing something, when in reality, the opportunity simply hasn't been created yet. That leads directly into the third thing you need to understand, which is that relationships matter more than searching when it comes to off-market homes. And this is one of the biggest mindset shifts, because most buyers are used to searching online, setting alerts, watching listings, waiting for something to appear, but off-market opportunities rarely work that way. They are not discovered through passive searching. They are developed through connection, through working with someone who is actively engaged in these neighborhoods, who knows which homeowners might be considering selling, and who can facilitate conversations that would not happen otherwise. And this is especially true in neighborhoods like Olmos Park, where inventory is limited and homeowners often stay for long periods of time. Because in those environments, opportunities are not consistently entering the market. They are created when the right conditions come together to make this even more practical. Think about 2 buyers, one who's simply searching online and waiting for something to appear, and the other who is actively working with someone connected to the local market, sharing exactly what they're looking for and staying engaged in the process. The second buyer is much more likely to be part of a conversation when an off-market opportunity develops, not because they have special access, but because they are positioned within the flow of information. And when you step back and look at the first 3 points together, you begin to see that off-market homes are not about finding something hidden. They're about understanding how opportunities are created, how information moves, how positioning yourself correctly makes you part of that process. And that shift alone changes how you approach the entire search. Once you understand that off-market homes are not invisible, but instead have limited exposure, and that they are driven by seller motivation rather than broad demand, and that relationships matter far more than simply searching online, the fourth thing you need to understand is that off-market homes are not automatically better opportunities. They're just simply different opportunities. And this is where a lot of buyers unintentionally build the wrong expectations, because the idea of an off-market home often feels like an advantage. It feels like you're getting access to something before anyone else does. It feels like maybe there's less competition or even the possibility of a better price. But in reality, that's not always how it works. And in many cases, the opposite can be true, because sellers who choose to sell off-market are often doing so from a position of strength, not urgency. And that distinction matters, because when a seller is under pressure to sell, they are not looking to create competition, and they are also not motivated to discount the home just to make a deal happen. And to make this more tangible, imagine a homeowner in Alamo Heights who's lived in their home for many years. They have significant equity, and they're just simply open to selling if the right opportunity presents itself. That seller is not testing the market. They're not looking for multiple offers. They're not looking for ways to negotiate aggressively. They're looking for alignment. And that means the pricing conversation in an off-market situation often feels very different from what buyers expect in a traditional listing, where competition and visibility can create leverage. And that's why it's important to approach off-market opportunities without assuming they are inherently better, and instead evaluate them based on how they fit your goals, your timing, and the specific property itself. And that leads directly to the fifth thing you need to understand, which is that timing in off-market spaces is much less predictable, but often more flexible. This is when one of the biggest differences between off-market homes and traditional listings come into play, because when a home is listed publicly, there's a clear structure. It goes live, showings begin, interest builds, and there's usually a defined window where decisions are made. But in the off-market space, that structure doesn't always exist. Instead, you're often working within a conversation that evolves over time and can feel unfamiliar at first, because there isn't always a clear starting point or end point. And to make this more real, you might become aware of potential opportunity in Terrell Hills. A homeowner is considering selling, but not immediately. And that conversation may take weeks or even months to develop. And then at a certain point, the seller may decide they are ready. And because the connection is already there and the process is started, it can move much more quickly than a traditional listing. And that kind of timing requires a different mindset. It requires patience on the front end and readiness on the back end. And this is where many buyers either become frustrated or disengaged, because they are used to a more structured process. But when you understand that off-market timing is fluid, not fixed, it becomes much easier to navigate. And that leads directly to the sixth thing you need to understand, which is that preparation matters more in off-market situations than it does in a traditional market. And this is where many buyers underestimate what's required, because without visibility and competition of a public listing, there's often less time to react and more expectation that you are prepared. And what we consistently see is that buyers who are most successful in this space are the ones who have already done the work on the front end. They understand their financial position. They know their price range. They have clarity around what they are looking for, and they are able to evaluate an opportunity quickly and confidently when it presents itself. That doesn't mean rushing into a decision. It means prepared enough to recognize when something aligns and to act on it without hesitation. And to bring this into a real-world example, we had a homeowner at Olmos Park who was open to selling privately, and the conversation began. That seller was not looking to go through the long process of uncertainty. They were looking for a buyer who understands opportunity, who can evaluate it clearly, and who can move forward in a way that feels smooth and intentional. And the buyer that we found didn't want to miss opportunity. But they were not sure what to do, so they just moved forward because they were ready when the moment came. And this is also where working with someone who understands the local market becomes incredibly important, because navigating off-market opportunities is not just about knowing they exist. It's about understanding how to evaluate them, how to compare them to publicly listed homes, and how to structure an approach that aligns with seller expectations. When you step back and you look at these 3 points together, you begin to see that off-market homes require a different kind of strategy, one that is less about finding something hidden and more about being positioned to respond when the right situation develops. And when you understand that shift, the entire process becomes much more clear, much more manageable, and much more effective. Once you understand that off-market homes are not completely hidden, but instead selectively shared, that they are driven by seller motivation rather than broad exposure, that relationships in these situations matter more than searching, and they are not automatically better opportunities, but simply different ones. That timing is less predictable, but often more flexible, and that preparations essentially is required if you want to move forward when the right opportunity presents itself. The seventh and most important thing you need to understand about how to actually position yourself to access off-market homes in areas like Alamo Heights, Terrell Hills, Olmos Park, or Monte Vista this is really where we see most buyers get stuck. They understand the idea, they've heard the terminology, but they don't know what to actually do differently. What's important to understand is that access to off-market homes is not something you find. It's something you build. It's something you build through three very specific components: clarity, readiness, connection. Each of those plays a very different role in how the opportunities actually reach you. And even if one of these pieces is missing, it becomes significantly harder to access this part of the market. So let's walk through what that actually looks like in real terms, because this is where the concept becomes actionable. The first piece is clarity. It sounds simple, but often this is where things break down, because many buyers describe what they're looking for in very general terms. They say they want a home in Alamo Heights, or something in a certain price range, or something updated. But in the off-market space, that level of generalization is not enough, because there's no system filtering options for you. There's no search result narrowing things down. Opportunities are identified through conversations. And if your criteria is too broad, it becomes very difficult for anyone to recognize when something is a match for you. But when your criteria is specific, when it includes details like location within the neighborhood, architectural style, lot size, level of updates, layout preferences, and even whether you're flexible or not on timing, because it makes it much easier for someone to connect you to the right opportunity when it comes up. And to make this more real, imagine two buyers, one who says they're opening to anything in Alamo Heights, and another says they are specifically looking for a one-story home on a quiet street with a certain type of layout and a certain level of updates. The second buyer is much easier to match an off-market property opportunity to, because the criteria is clear. And that clarity is what allows conversations to turn into real opportunities. And the second piece is readiness. And this is where many buyers unintentionally lose momentum, because in a traditional listing, you often have time to react. You see the home, you schedule a showing, you think about it, and when you decide to move forward. But in an off-market situation, the expectation is often different. If a seller's willing to have the conversation, they're usually expecting that the buyer on the other side is prepared to move forward if the opportunity makes sense for them. That doesn't mean rushing into a decision, but it does mean having your financing in place, understanding your purchasing power, being mentally prepared to evaluate a home without the same level of public validation that comes with a listed property. And this is especially important in higher end neighborhoods like Terrell Hills, where sellers often prioritize a smooth, low-friction transaction over maximizing exposure. Because from their perspective, the value of an off-market sale is not just the price, it's convenience, privacy, and control. And buyers who are prepared to stand out immediately in that environment do better, because they remove any uncertainty from the process. And what makes the seller more comfortable moving forward is that preparation. To make this even more practical, think about a scenario where a homeowner is considering selling privately. They are introduced to two potential buyers, one who needs time to figure out financing, confirm their position, and another who already has the clarity and can move forward confidently. The second buyer is naturally going to be much stronger position, not because they offered more, but because they created less friction. And that leads directly to the third thing, which is connection. And this is where access is actually created, because off-market opportunities move through relationships. They move through agents who are actively engaged in these neighborhoods. They move through conversations with homeowners, and they move through networks that are built over time. This is not about exclusivity in a way that's often portrayed. It's simply information flowing in a market where not everything is publicly listed. And what we consistently see is buyers who are connected to these networks, who are working with someone who is actively involved in areas like Alamo Heights, tend to have more visibility into opportunities as they develop. And that visibility doesn't guarantee access, but it creates a possibility that does really make a difference. To bring this into real world context, imagine a homeowner casually mentioning that they would consider selling if the right opportunity came along. That conversation doesn't go into a database. It doesn't show up online. It stays within a very small circle. And if you're connected to that circle through the right relationships, you may be introduced to that opportunity before it ever becomes public. And that's how off-market homes actually work in practice. When you step back and you look at all these 7 points together, you begin to see a very clear structure. First, off-market homes are not invisible. They are selectively shared. Second, they are driven by seller motivation rather than broad exposure. Third, relationships matter more than searching. Fourth, they are not inherently better opportunities, just different ones. Fifth, timing is less predictable, but often more flexible. Sixth, preparation is essential. And now seventh, access is built through clarity, readiness, and connection. When those elements are in place, the off-market space becomes much more understandable, much more approachable. And this is also where I want to bring everything back to what this means to you if you're considering buying in one of these areas. Because the goal is not to feel like you're missing out, or maybe there's something hidden you don't know about, is to understand how this part of the market works so you can decide how you want to approach it. This is exactly where we guide our clients through the process. I'm Caroline Decherd with the Park Properties Group at the Phyllis Browning Company. And one of the things we focus on is helping you understand both visible and the less visible parts of the market so you can move forward with clarity. Whether that means identifying opportunities before they become widely available, or simply making sure that when something does come up, you're in a position to evaluate it confidently. And if you're thinking about buying in the next 6 to 12 months, especially in neighborhoods like Alamo Heights, Terrell Hills, Olmos Park, or Monte Vista, the best next step is to start that conversation early, to define what you're looking for and understand your position. Begin building the kind of connection that allows you to be part of these opportunities as they develop. Because in this part of the market, access isn't about finding something hidden. It's about being positioned when the right opportunity comes together. And when you approach it that way, the process becomes much more strategic and really much more intentional and ultimately much more successful. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Caroline with the Park Properties Group at the Phyllis Browning Company. If you need anything, give me a call.